The native people of the Inside Passage know from our creation stories that we've lived here since the beginning of time. These islands, channels, bays, and beaches have always been central to our existence. The passage sustains us. Legends of its real and supernatural beings inspire us. Its beauty, power, and turbulence are reflected in our spirits.
The Inside Passage is just as powerful for those of us who came after, and are still coming, seeking everything from salmon to solitude to snapshots, here on the northwest edge of a continent.
Now Siam, Chenoa Egawa sanasna. Hello, my name is Chenoa Egawa. I'm a member of the Lummi and Sklallam nations. These are our waters. Not that long ago, the only boats you'd see passing through here were my ancestors in canoes.
And I'm Bob Simmons. I'm one of those who came after, about 30 years ago. The Inside Passage has changed so much in the thousands of years that people have found a home here. Yet one of the most astonishing things about the passage is the many ways in which it hasn't changed in all that time.
It's still one of the most beautiful places in the world, and it's become one of the most culturally compelling as well.
It also serves as a vital marine highway for doing business now and from the time when business was done almost entirely in canoes.
At its southern end, the Inside Passage begins here in Puget Sound, site of Seattle and Tacoma, and the ancestral homelands of the Suquamish, Duwamish, and more than 20 other Indian nations.
From Puget Sound, the passage goes north, past the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the San Juan Islands, across the international border into the Strait of Georgia, between Vancouver Island and the mainland of British Columbia.
After 1,000 miles and thousands more islands, inlets, channels, and sounds, the Inside Passage's northern end is the Alaska Panhandle, home of the Haidas and Tlinkits.
Some anthropologists claim the first people to come here walked across the Bering Strait land bridge from Asia 30,000 years ago. But there are other explanations for the passage and its peoples.
Raven looked down one day and saw a tiny island below him and commanded it to become Earth. The new Earth grew and grew and grew, and then Raven cut it into 2 pieces. Out of the small piece, he made Haida Gwaii, and out of the big piece, he made the rest of the world. Later, he heard a sound coming from a clamshell, and he saw a small face there, and then 5 faces, and 5 little bodies. These were the first people, and that was the beginning.
Since the first people arrived, however they arrived, the Inside Passage has inspired legends, stories, and chronicles of life on the edge of the sea. One storyteller was Jonathan Rabin, whose book Passage to Juneau tells of his sailing trip north in 1996.
To put oneself afloat on a sea route as old and heavily traveled as the Inside Passage was to join the epic cavalcade of all those, present and past, who found some meaning in these waters.
Jonathan Rabin was following in the wake of long-ago explorers, Russians, Spaniards, and the English like Cook and George Vancouver, many seeking the Northwest Passage, a shortcut to Asia's riches, through an inconvenient North America composed of trees and rivers, not riches.
Explorer Juan de Fuca, 1596. I came to a latitude of 47 degrees, with a broad inlet sea. At the entrance of this strait there is on the northwest coast thereof a great island. I saw people clad in animal skins. I thought that I had now well delivered my office, seeking a northwest passage, and not being armed to resist the force of the savage people, I therefore set sail and returned homewards.
Explorers like Juan de Fuca reported in their ship's logs their first contact with natives. The natives passed their first contact stories along to their children and grandchildren. Practically every Indian nation on the Inside Passage has a story of seeing the big ships for the first time. Tulalip storyteller Johnny Moses.
Long ago, our people had legends of spirits or human beings arriving in large canoes. And that day arrived when the people looked out to the water and they seen this huge canoe. They went out on their own canoes, bearing gifts. As they approached the large canoe, the Europeans fired their cannon out of fear of the natives. The sound of the gun was so loud it brought fear to the native people. They thought it was great thunder. They asked the men on the huge canoe, "Are you spirits or human beings?" Thinking they could speak at least one of their languages, but there was no answer.
Other early explorers were mapping what they thought their countries already owned and protecting it from challengers.
It was the Spanish who were convinced that they really owned the whole West Coast.
Dee Longenbaugh has been studying Northwest explorers for decades. She owns the Observatory, a Juneau bookshop.
Well, then they heard the Russians were moving east from Siberia. And they were feeling quite threatened. So they decided to send some expeditions up just to forestall that. And of course, sadly for them, they were towards the, they were at the very end of the Spanish Empire. And England was the rising country. Vancouver was sent to rule out the Northwest Passage because there was so much feeling in England that the Spanish and the Portuguese had gotten the southern oceans. Well, God surely loved England best of all, and there surely was a Northwest Passage, and it was up to them to find it, and they had been looking for a very long time.
George Vancouver was pleasantly surprised by what he found in the Pacific Northwest. From his memoirs.
The country had presented a delightful prospect. Spacious meadows, elegantly adorned. Nature had here provided the well-stocked park and wanted only the assistance of art to constitute that desirable assemblage of surface which is so much sought in other countries. George Vancouver, Commander-in-Chief, HMS Discovery.
In the early days, Vancouver praised everything he saw, seeing in the forested islands and flowing waters.
A picture so pleasing could not fail to recall to our remembrance certain delightful and beloved situations in Old England.
But his view would change the farther he went. His first bad moment came in a place that looked like suitable passage, but where tide, wind, and current can quickly combine to turn extremely dangerous and navigable only by the smallest boats. He had been deceived by the gentle tide, so he named the place Deception Pass. 200 years later, Jonathan Rabin found the pass just as challenging as Vancouver did.
As the tide enters the funnel, it feels the tightening constraint of the land. The bottom shallows and house-sized boulders trip the water up and make it tumble. With far too much sea trying to escape through far too small an aperture, liquid panic breaks out in the pass. The obstructed tide wells up vertically in mushroom-topped boils a dozen yards across. The surface of the water is pitted with small, traveling whirlpools.
Vancouver wasn't the first to approach Deception Pass with caution. My people knew the pass as Chungus, the place of whirlpools.
Not so long ago, the people of the Samish tribe lived near the waters of the Deception Pass. A young, beautiful woman named Kukwalawut was on a vision quest for her Skalalitu. During her quest, she saw a whirlpool in the distance. It became a handsome man before her very eyes. She fell instantly in love, so she returned to the sea with him. After time had passed, she returned to her village to announce her marriage. The people were shocked. Her skin was covered in barnacles, and sea kelp was growing from her eyes and her ears. The people knew she was no longer theirs. They knew that her heart belonged with her love in the sea. In gratitude of her release to the sea, she still guides and protects our canoes through these rough waters. Sometimes you can even see her hair waving in the water.
Just north of the San Juans, a traveler on the Inside Passage leaves the United States, crossing an unseen, but at least by Canadians, deeply felt borderline. From Passage to Juneau.
Here, nature and politics appear for once to coincide. Here, Canadians can look out on America across a stretch of water that corresponds to the metaphysical gulf of history, taste, and sensibility that, as every Canadian I know believes, separates the two countries. Canadians ache for sea room, and here, for 130 nautical miles, America is blessedly overseas.
Georgia Strait may serve as a psychological border, but it's not much of a physical one. Americans have been coming north for generations, with a big invasion in 1897. It started when a ship landed in Seattle bringing wealthy men who had just found gold in the Klondike. The next morning, the first of hundreds of ships full of greenhorn prospectors left town for the gold fields, one inside passage away. Of the 100,000 who sought their fortunes in the Yukon, 70% passed through Seattle, which quickly doubled in size and became the most talked about municipality in America, full of merchants who made far more money selling supplies to the miners than most miners ever made using them. The lesson was not lost on those merchants and their descendants. Seattle has looked north ever since. Thousands of people still use Seattle as a gateway to the Inside Passage, but now it's the passage itself that draws them. Tourists come cruising for anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks. One of the earliest tourists arrived in 1879, a Scottish immigrant who would eventually become America's most renowned naturalist, John Muir.
Every face glowed with natural love of wild beauty. The islands were seen in long perspective, their forests dark green with varying tones of blue growing more and more tender in the distance. Bays full of hazy meadows and lofty headlands with fine arching insteps dipping their feet in the shining water. Every eye was turned to the mountains, while the word of God was being read in the majestic hieroglyphs blazoned along the sky.
John Muir's Inside Passage was full of noble red men in canoes, invariably described as venerable, serene, or possessed of grave dignity. When these Indians talked via interpreters, they speechified in ornate Victorian English with sonorous periods and overextended similes drawn from the natural world. It was John Muir Indians whom Edward S. Curtis, the Seattle-based photographer, pictured in the 5 volumes he devoted to the Inside Passage in his epic series, The North American Indian. His posed sepia studies, with every trace of the modern artfully banished from the frame, exult in the romance of the primitive.
Save one that is God. Thou knowest the commandments: do not commit adultery, do not kill, do not steal, do not fear.
St. Nicholas Orthodox Church in Juneau, built by Tlingit converts in 1894. Here, their children and grandchildren gather on Sunday morning to sing the ancient prayers, watched over by iconic paintings of the missionaries and martyrs who first aggressively proselytized their ancestors.
Let us pray to the Lord.
In the vestibule, St. Nicholas's history is presented in pictures of former congregations. Over time, many Tlinkits accepted the Christian religious dogmas, especially when they discovered that their shamans couldn't cure the new diseases, like smallpox, the Westerners brought. Enticed to services by gifts, they also generally preferred the Russian Orthodox Church to other Christian faiths because its ceremonies were held in their own language. Most other missionaries and government officials prohibited any native languages in their services or their schools.
Missionary Carrie Willard, Haines, Alaska, October 1881. Raven is the Chilkat's supreme being. He is creator and preserver of all things. For not only did he make the world, but upon his wings it is born. The end of the world will come when he flies from under it.
Neeks way, Adikut way, yes. Yo way, Kanonik. Raven, walking along the beach. It was the beginning of time. The whole world was dark. The stars, the moon, and sun were kept in boxes by a wealthy old man. He lived at the headwaters of the Nass River. The fisherman of the night told Raven of these treasures, and so Raven, he went to the house of Nashakankawu. There, Raven, he saw Nashakonkawu's beautiful daughter. She was drinking water by the stream. Raven, he changed his spirit into a tiny spruce needle, and when the beautiful daughter drank, Raven fell into her cup, and when she swallowed Raven, and soon Raven grew inside of her, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Raven in the form of a human child.
While many Tlinkits accepted the new religions, they didn't abandon their traditional beliefs. They continued to hold their own ceremonies, and they still do today. But there is one phenomenon that occurs in practically every culture and belief system on Earth. Kwakwaka'wakw elder Vera Newman.
The creation story that Granny's tribe comes from, the creation story, and her crest is the butterfly, and it starts with a great flood. Most of our legends come with the stories of the great flood too, just like what you see in the Bible. That really amazed me.
On the Inside Passage, flood stories had a real, natural origin. Even today, some coastal peoples introduce themselves by saying, "Hualhualakwasan," I am a descendant of those who survived the flood.
George, Vancouver, August 1792. We have reached as desolate and inhospitable a country as the most melancholy creature could be desirous of inhabiting. The eagle, crow, and raven that occasionally had borne us company in our lonely researches visited not these dreary shores.
Vancouver's initial euphoria with the Inside Passage diminished the farther north he went. He found the steep-sided inlets near the Georgia Strait ugly, intimidating, and useless, not the future sites of English estates that he'd seen before.
The ruins of one miserable hut was the only indication we saw that human beings ever resorted to the country before us, which appeared to be devoted entirely to the amphibious race, seals and sea otters.
Unlike their commander, a middle-class bureaucrat's son educated almost entirely at sea, Vancouver's officers, the upper-class sons of earls and lords, were entering the realm of the romantic sublime, the belief that nature, to be true and beautiful, must also inspire fear. From Passage to Juneau.
This was a movement that had passed Vancouver by. Here on the northwest coast, where the ocean sucked and grumbled, Captain Van was nearly at the heart of the modish sublime. But nothing in the landscape stirred him to poetry. He found it simply alien, and ideas of the sublime suspect and pretentious.
From the log of Archibald Menzies, ship's surgeon, July 1792. Near the bottom of a deep cove, there was a beautiful waterfall which issued from a lake close behind it. Its wild, romantic appearance rendered it a place of resort for small parties during our stay.
Vancouver didn't feel that way, and his feelings have endured in his name for it.
This area afforded not a single prospect that was pleasing to the eye, whence the place obtained the name of Desolation Sound.
For believers in the romantic sublime, the lands and waters of the Inside Passage were beautiful because they seemed dangerous. For native peoples, they were dangerous.
Ha mama, hey, oh, hey, hey, hey.
One of the stories that Granny told us when we were young is about the wild man of the woods, the Bukwis. The Bukwis is a very shy man, scared of humans. He always comes down to the beach, and then he turns all the time looking behind to make sure that no one's looking at him, because he doesn't want anybody to see him. And he's digging for cockles, because that's what he likes to eat. People that get lost at sea, people that are never found, some part of what they say is that they turn into a Bukwis, because they end up eating from what's in the woods.
Whites felt more at home on the land, but our ancestors lived on a ribbon of shoreline. Their lives were centered on the water, the sea, the sound, the rivers.
To sing it, to ning it, to stay it, to hang it, to stay in it. Long ago in ancient times, our native people were afraid of the water. Until one day, our people looked out into the water and the water spoke to them. And they heard the voices of the water, and it said not to be afraid. And they seen the sparkles of the water, and they knew that was the ancestors. And to this day, our people know, every time we look out into the waters and see the sparkles, we are not alone, and that is all.
German geographer Oral Krauss, 1881. In spite of the fact that the Tlingit is constantly surrounded by nature, He is only acquainted with it as it offers him the necessities of life. He knows every bay that lends itself to fishing or the beaching of a canoe, but the mountain peaks are scarcely noticed by him.
A brief visitor to southeast Alaska, Oral Krause apparently failed to notice that the famous Chilkat Tlingit blanket was woven from mountain goat wool. But most coastal Indian life was just that, coastal, and it began in a longhouse facing the sea, a central dwelling place, but also an arena where people held ceremonies and social gatherings, and where learning and sharing of lifeways took place. Usually built of cedar logs and planks, each longhouse was a work of art, where the history of the extended family that lived there is told in ornate carvings and paintings, using designs, crests, and symbols handed down from generation to generation. In the longhouse, Indian people kept their treasures. It's where Nashashakawu of the Tlinkits kept the sun, the moon, and the stars, until Raven came along, disguised as a man.
Raven had a plan. He was going to get the stars, the moon, and sun for all the people of the world. Raven, he pointed to the first box, the one that contained the stars, and he began to cry. No, you can't have that. But like all grandfathers, he gave in to his grandson. He took that box down, the box that contained the stars, and he placed it in front of his grandson. Raven played on that box, and when nobody was looking, Raven opened that box, and the stars flew into the nighttime sky forever. My precious objects gone forever. Raven, he did the same with the moon and the sun box. And when nobody was looking, Raven took the last box, the one that is called the Box of Daylight.
In 1914, Edward Curtis made a film which he titled In the Land of the Headhunters, undoubtedly to lure in thrill-seeking white audiences. It was much more reasonably retitled In the Land of the War Canoes in the 1960s. Even with its stale boy-meets-girl plot, the film attempted to accurately portray the life of the Kwakwaka'wakw of British Columbia, but not when it was made, more like 100 years before. For the Kwakwaka'wakw and their cultural and geographical neighbors, the sea was essential to existence. Bill Cranmer, one of the hereditary chiefs of the Namgis First Nation.
The Namgis, like many of our neighbors, the Kwakwala-speaking people, who we now call the Kwakwaka'wakw, were connected to the sea in many ways. During the many seasons, our people would move from place to place in their canoes for harvesting the resources. Even a lot of our creation stories are connected to the undersea kingdom. The salmon that returned every year, the halibut that our people caught and prepared to take them through the winter months. All the resources of the sea were used by our people. That's, I think, what allowed them to survive.
There was a village in front of a glacier. One day, this glacier began to move forward. The waters began to rise. The village began to flood. They knew they had to find a new location for their village. The men took their canoes out to find this place, and they were gone. The women, the children, and elders were left behind to pack away their objects, their precious objects. They stuck everything out onto the beach. The glacier moved forward, and soon they found their old village underwater. All that was left was just this beach. They didn't know what to do. They asked te ki'akau, atlishko has. Look after us, look after us. And they slept. When they awoke, there was 4 canoes on the beach. They didn't know where they came from, but they didn't question this. They took all their belongings and loaded the canoes, and they headed out. It was as if the canoes were alive, as if they moved through the water by themselves. They met up with the men. They went to the new location of the village. They were happy to see each other. They unloaded all of their belongings, and the men asked them, where did these canoes come from? And they turned to look at them, and they watched 4 whales swimming away.
When your existence is tied to the sea, much of your life is spent on the sea, so the canoe was an essential part of that life.
For my grandfather, he used to pull out in the waters, pull canoe. Some of my great-grandfathers, and that was their main mode of transportation. They would just get in the canoe and pull to the villages, and of course it didn't take 10 to 15 minutes that it does now to go to a reservation, to the next reservation. But once they got there, from the stories that I've been told, is they had celebrations, and there was such a happiness to see each other, and such a warmth, and that the whole journey was worth it.
Deborah Parker, a member of the Tulalip Nation, is one of many now reconnecting to her heritage and history by pulling canoe as her ancestors did.
I think part of the experience that I've witnessed is when I'm in the canoe and I've known that my ancestors have been through these waters. That to me brings me alive. That to me reminds me that I do have a strong culture. I do have a strong path. When I'm in my own waters, when I'm up around Lummi, or when I'm around the islands up north, there's no other feeling.
Vancouver and all the other explorers and missionaries saw a lot of Indian canoes. They needed to trade with the Indians to replenish their food supplies. In turn, native peoples were curious about the visitors and looking to do some business.
Well, this is summer, and they should be very busy. They're putting up fish, and it's their winter supplies. They're picking berries, got all this stuff they have to do, so why would they have the ships wait around? And it just hit me one day, one of those little epiphanies, and you say, yes, and then you realize you have no way on earth to prove it. I think it was entertainment. The circus had come to town. Here were these strange men in these funny-looking clothes, these funny-looking ships. They had all these neat trade goods. They had all these strange ways. They were so entertaining. One of the great advantages the native people had in trading was that they had been trading among themselves for Lord knows how many hundreds, if not thousands of years. They were very astute, clever traders. And when the European traders came along, oh good, fresh meat.
Once upon a time, people made their way across the sea by reading the surface, shapes, and colors of the water. On clear nights, they took their direction from the stars. By day, they sailed by the wind and waves. Wind made itself most useful for navigational purposes by generating swells. Whatever the fickle gusts of the moment, the prevailing seasonal wind was registered in the stubborn movement of the sea. Swell continues for many days and sometimes thousands of miles after the wind that first raised it has blown itself out. Islands, because they deflect the direction of swell, can be felt from a great distance by a sensitive pilot. As the depth of the seas decreases, the swell steepens, warning of imminent landfall. Sailing by swell entailed an intense concentration on the character of the sea itself.
George Vancouver was a brilliant navigator and a master sailor. But there are places in the Inside Passage where the wind and the tide can turn treacherous, as Vancouver learned the day he ran the Discovery aground in the rocky shallows of Queen Charlotte Strait.
Thomas Manby, master's mate. The ship struck on a reef of rocks, every effort made to disengage her. Unfortunately, the ebb tide was running strong. 7 long and tedious hours we sat on the ship's side.
Running aground was unpleasant and embarrassing for Vancouver, and his outlook soured even more when the Discovery finally arrived in Alaskan waters and he met the Tlinkits. Jonathan Rabin.
The Tlingits were northerners, living on the same latitude as the citizens of Aberdeen, Scotland. Parsimony and joylessness were what the English always expected of people of the north, and they were quick to nail the Tlingits as surly, mean, and rowdy. It was as if Discovery had made a 3/4 circumnavigation of the world, only to be surrounded by a race of grim, half-naked Scotsmen with lip ornaments and bows and arrows.
One chief advanced. A powder horn was across his shoulders and a clean, bright brass blunderbuss lying near him, which he frequently took up and pointed at Mr. Whitby. George Vancouver, feeling surrounded.
From Passage to Juneau.
Alaska has been continuously beset by transient hunter-gatherers equipped with harpoons, dynamite, shovels, axes, backhoes, gold pans, oil drills, chainsaws, and fishing nets. Few of the immigrants had any intention of settling the land they came to plunder. Home was far elsewhere. They had no interest in farming the Alaskan soil. In 1958, when statehood was granted, only 20,000 acres were under cultivation.
In 1880, a Tlingit chief showed 2 prospectors a site on Gastineau Canal in southeast Alaska that was laden with quartz, laced with gold. Native people weren't allowed to file mining claims on their own land, but these white newcomers were. They established a town in the traditional homeland of the Auk Tlingit, a town that would become Juneau.
During the next half-century, men would come from all over the world to work in the mines. The ore of Juneau's gold belt wasn't washed out of streams by prospectors. It was chewed out of mountains, and the raw ore run through tunnels, down piers, onto boats. Cold, wet, loud work. It's called hard rock mining. Tons of granite were ground up for every ounce of gold recovered.
The fines were ground to sand from which the gold was recovered. But these larger rocks were passed over endless belts, 100 yards long.
Tom Stewart, a member of the cleanup gang.
And they had native and Filipino laborers, and they stood up against the belt and they picked off every rock that showed quartz. I picked up after spills from the grinding machines. My father described my job as chief engineer on a number 2 shovel. And I got to shovel lots of muck.
But eventually there was just too much muck for the amount of gold it yielded. The mines closed, the buildings were abandoned, the docks rotted away, and Alaska, perhaps inexhaustible only in rain and vegetation, grew up around the ruins.
Alaska had been ransacked and abused. Anywhere else in the world, such punishment would have left a permanently wrecked ground zero. But the climate here was astonishingly forgiving. 160 inches of rainfall a year are a great healer of wounded landscapes. In Alaska, the wilderness quickly grew back, to cover mankind's ugly depredations.
We used to have a run of sockeye in year in the May. It used to be the first run. And the second run would show up in August, about the same time as the Fraser River fish pass through here.
Roy Cranmer and his crew have been fishing together out of Alert Bay for 50 years.
At that time there was a lot of boats here, eh? Must have had, 50 sailors at that time. And everybody had a job. It was easy to get a job at that time. I started when I was 14.
Yeah.
I've been fishing ever since, except for a few years I worked in the shipyards.
But now, according to the people in power who oversee fishing, some fish runs, and especially salmon, are dangerously diminished.
The fisheries have, last year we had, I think it was either 6 or a 10-hour opening for all those fish that were going by here.
Roy and his crew are members of the Nangis First Nations, so loss of fishing isn't just an economic hardship for them. It's also loss of an important part of their culture, their history.
By the time George Vancouver got to Alaska, he didn't want any more adventures. He was tired of the journey and ill with what he described as attacks of bilious colic.
Thomas Manby. Good health continues in our little squadron, though I am sorry to add not that good fellowship, which ought to subsist with adventurers travelling these distant seas, owing to the conduct of our Commander-in-Chief, who has grown haughty, proud, mean and insolent, which has kept himself and officers in a continual state of wrangling during the whole of the voyage.
I remained in the most uncomfortable state of suspense that can be imagined until Tuesday, August 19th, 1794, when we had the indescribable satisfaction of seeing the 4 boats enter the harbour together. George Vancouver waiting for the last survey party, long overdue.
So, with the Northwest Coast charted and the non-existence of a Northwest Passage conclusively proved, George Vancouver went home to England to write his memoirs and die young, unheralded and unpromoted. He had offended the wrong people.
He did a lot of flogging, and of course flogging was very common in the British Navy then, but he did even more than his share. And he flogged Thomas Pitt twice, and then sent him home. And when he got back home, when Vancouver reached England, that is, he discovered Pitt's father had died, and he was now Lord Camelford, and his uncle was the Prime Minister, William Pitt. Bad timing, Vancouver.
Vancouver's legacy isn't in England, but on the passage. He renamed practically everything he saw, replacing ancient and intriguing native names with tributes to his crew, his sponsors, and powerful English families. Vancouver's exploring successors continued the practice. Yalis, Spreading Leg Beach, became Alert Bay. Nalachstala, or Having Mouth Upstream, became Point McNeil. The island named in honor of Admiral Pulteney Malcolm was previously Clack Scudis, or Seaward Opposite Beaches, and hundreds of wonderfully helpful names like Sail Tearing Place, Shallow in Middle of Water, and Having Spider Crabs were lost forever.
From Seattle to Skagway, boats full of tourists by the thousands have helped make up for the logging, fishing, and mining industries that once sustained so many. But the summer invasion of cruise ships is a mixed blessing. Kai Augustine of Juneau.
There's some minuses when you get an influx of tour ships coming in, like maybe 7 tour ships all at once. The local people stay away from downtown. There's too many people. There's 10,000 people at one whack, and that's not counting a crew.
I was hired to go on the boat Westerdam, and I was on there for 2 weeks. and I did my beading, and the whole trip was paid for, and everything that I did on the boat was paid for, and all I had to do was show my work 2 hours a day, and that was no sweat. I loved it.
Tlingit Priscilla Martin.
I think I was a local color curiosity, but I enjoyed it. I really did. I think my husband dragged me out of there kicking and screaming. I just loved it. I did. I loved it.
Priscilla Martin perpetuates her Tlingit heritage by beading. And there are hundreds of other Native artists working to sustain and advance the ancient skills. Like Kwakwaka'wakw silversmith Cody Nelson.
I'm going to be making a killer whale here, and this main part here will be the head, and these two on the sides here are going to be the fins of the killer whale. Every time I go to the museum or something, I always try and make a point of going to look at their collection. I often think about what it must have been like for the older people, because they didn't have these type of tools, and to be able to have to pound down the coins and stuff that they used. It's a lot different than now.
What I'm working on here, I got a 4-foot pole happening, and got a raven at the top, and on the bottom here I'll have a chief, and he'll be holding a speaker's staff.
Stephen Bruce.
You have to keep pushing forward and learning. I think we'll always be learning, but there's a lot there to learn. Like for a totem pole, you might take a walk down to the cemetery there and look at all the old poles and get some ideas of what the other artists were doing in their time and borrow some of those ideas.
Artists and visitors can see remarkable Kwakwaka'wakw pieces in the Potlatch collection at the Umista Cultural Center in Alert Bay. Potlatch is a Chinook jargon word for an Indian ceremonial gathering, both spiritual and social. Umista means returned treasure, and that's what these pieces are, sacred objects taken by the Canadian government from Namgis members arrested for potlatching. Most of the art was returned after almost 60 years, and the culture is returning as well. Essential stories, traditional and ancient songs and dances, and the native languages that officials tried so hard for so long to suppress and eliminate.
The story that Granny used to tell us when we were young was about a young boy called Simgirsta, who was born with a hair lip. Because of that, the other children of the village would not play with them. They always made fun of him. Juneau was a big wild woman of the woods, and she was a big giant who had big breasts and big hollow eyes and big red piercing lips that went ooh, ooh. That's the sound that Juneau made. And the children of the village were told never to go to the certain part of the field because of a Juneau, because the Juneau will eat the children. But because of the rejection from the other children, Simgirsta was never allowed to play with them. And one day, Simgirsta could see the Juneau, and he'd point, Adsan Tukul, Adsan Tukul, Kirkikwala Giltslach Atle Yesat Chatas. Him. I I work hard to keep our language alive and to be part of the cultural rebirth amongst our Kwakwaka'wakw people.
If I had the opportunity to live 200-300 years ago, yeah, I would love to. I'd love to raise my children in that sort of environment where teachings come to them through the elders, through exploring through the land and on the water. I think that's what I'm searching for now in this modern time, is searching for that way to raise my children so that they know what it's like to have peace with the land and to be at peace with themselves. I think they'll be happier people.
I wouldn't trade it for anything. I'd do it all over again.
Vancouver's early vision of the Inside Passage as the future home of stately mansions and lush gardens has happened in some places, in the San Juans, and the tulip fields of the Skagit Valley, where Dutch immigrants saw Holland of the New West and made it happen. But there are still many places on the Inside Passage that look the way they did when Vancouver first saw them.
The Indians had lived on tiptoe in small numbers on the extreme fringe of the forest, barely grazing the surface of the water. Then the great self-important juggernaut of American capitalism rumbled through the Pacific Northwest, clearing with chainsaws, paving it with asphalt, building bridges, banks, insurance towers, tract housing, and all the rest. Yet only a mile offshore you'd hardly notice, so modest seems its impact, compared with the urgent press of the forest and swirl of the tide. Squint a little, and you might for all intents and purposes be back in 1792, looking out on a nature that still awaited men with grandiose designs upon it.
Those men and women are still coming to the Inside Passage, but now they come faced with a challenge, a warning of sorts from the man who lies buried here, on a hillside overlooking the lands and waters he cherished.
He was a chief of the Duwamish and Suquamish named Seattle, which was anglicized to Seattle and then given in his honor to a city he helped found. In 1854, Chief Seattle made a speech in the Duwamish language that those with grand designs on the Inside Passage should remember. There's still controversy about whether this is a romanticized translation of his speech, but that doesn't make the words any less powerful now. To newcomers and to the native peoples who are working today to preserve and invigorate their cultures and traditions.
And when the last red man shall have perished, and the memory of my tribe shall have become a myth among the white men, these shores will swarm with the invisible dead of my tribe. And when your children's children think themselves alone in the field, the store, the shop, upon the highway, or in the silence of the pathless woods, they will not be alone. At night, when the streets of your cities and villages are silent and you think them deserted, they will throng with the returning hosts that once filled them and still love this beautiful land.